No, this isn't a Rorschach test or a spot the difference game. This is how I made two different fishing lures using the same template. This is also a proof of concept to show that you don't need a detailed template or intricate plans to make something. All you need is a rough outline, a bit of the wrong kind of glue, and a little imagination. It's always a good idea to leave some space between your template lines and your cutting path, but on builds like this where you don't have explicit plans to follow, try to leave a little extra room for error. In the spirit of playing it safe, I didn't want to use the belt sander for these. That thing can chew through balsa wood faster than my dogs chew through the table food they're not supposed to have. So, I used a sanding block to smooth everything down to the template lines before drawing the taper guides on the top and bottom of each lure. I used some calipers and a ruler to mark the important spots, and then I used my eyeballs to connect the dots. You didn't know you were getting Dr. Seuss today, did you? You might have noticed at the beginning that I cut one of these blocks slightly fatter than the other. I wanted the frog to be pretty wide and ugly, and the mouse to be more or less square. This won't only help with the shape, but I'll also be able to tell them apart a little bit easier as I'm working. As I mentioned earlier, when you're working on a project like this where you'll have to improvise a lot, you don't want to risk taking off too much material. So I used the utility knife this time to taper the noses instead of the belt sander or bandsaw like I normally would. This is a pretty easy process when you're working with balsa, but it will definitely make you regret using wood glue to attach your templates. I bought 5 glue sticks later that night so this would never happen again. As you'll see a little later, this is just one of many lessons I learned from this build. I've made a couple of frogs before, but I've never made a mouse, so I was excited to start drawing the carving lines on it first. However, I was disappointed when I realized the process would be pretty much the same for both lures. Mark the chamfer lines on the body, and don't carve the round lump on the head. Now that the lines were drawn, it didn't take long to finish shaping each critter. From this point on, the lures would look more and more different with each step. You can already start to see it a little bit with the chamfers carved, but the sanding stage is when you can really start to see how they're going to turn into their final forms. For the frog, the main thing I wanted to accomplish was to create a valley between the eye sockets to help them stick out from the head like they do on this guy. The mouse also got a valley to separate the ears, but needed some extra sanding to shape the rest of the ears and form a neck to help make the head distinct from the body. Once I was satisfied with how things were looking, I sanded both lures to 300 grit and sealed them with super glue. Adding the super glue here also gave the spongy balsa a little bit of protection from taking damage as I worked through the next steps. I used a bendy ruler to mark a center line, then I made a lead hole in the belly of each lure before cutting a slot for a wire harness. It's important to drill the lead hole first, because if you drill into a slot you've already cut, you run the risk of splitting the lure in half. The slots weren't quite wide enough for the wire after just using the saw, so I sanded them a little bit at a time until the harnesses just barely fit. Once I was happy with the position of the harnesses, I used too much super glue to secure them in place and set them aside to let the glue dry. I took some time to really appreciate what I had just done. Then I sanded the eyes to smooth out the broken one and make the other one match. But on the bright side, at least nothing caught on fire this time. As I gave the lead some time to cool, I took the opportunity to carve out some eye sockets on the mouse. I took the opportunity to carve out some eye sockets on the frog. A frog's eyes should be pretty bulgy, so I only wanted to make the sockets deep enough to guide the eyes into the right spot. Since I'd exposed some wood in the eye sockets, I needed to seal those up again. Then I filled in the lead holes and the wire slots with super glue and baking soda. As usual, I used thin layers of baking soda to avoid too much of it building up on the body, and so I wouldn't have cracks and pits ruining the finished products. To make sure you fully sealed a hole on a lure, you have to add a little more filler than it takes to just fill the hole. That means you'll also need to file or sand away the excess so the filler is flush with the rest of the lure. As a reminder, superglue and baking soda is probably harder than the wood you're using. So if you decide to try this build yourself, make sure you contact the wood as little as possible so you don't remove material you wanted to keep. The style of frog I'm making this time will have trailing legs that wiggle behind it while it's being reeled in. To accomplish this, I needed something to secure the legs to. I marked where I want the leg hardware to be and used the hand drill to make some pilot holes. When I use this method, I prefer to use one wire through the body to attach both legs to minimize the risk that it'll get pulled out of the soft balsa. But somebody decided to drill the pilot holes right where the wire harness sits, so I had to make two separate pieces for the legs to connect to. Essentially, these are just barbs that'll hold pieces of soft plastic I'll slide on at the end. This is the easiest way I've found to add legs to a lure, and also means they're easy to replace if they fall off. Okay, let's talk about paint. First, this is the build that made me realize my collection of airbrush paint is almost 5 years old and really shouldn't be put in an airbrush anymore. You'll see a lot of my sprays here are uneven and spit out clumps of gooey paint. Any plans I had of a detailed paint job went out the window pretty quick, and you'll see where I just started laying down super thick layers just to get color on the baits. Second, I really hadn't decided yet if my frog was actually going to be a frog or if I wanted to paint a toad. I've only ever painted frogs before, and I thought a toad might be fun, so I laid down a brown coat first. Since I was forced to use heavy coats, I thought I'd be slick and try a new technique. While my thick coat was still fresh and wet, I just shot air out of the brush to make ripples that I hoped would give it a bumpy texture. I think it worked, but it was kind of hard to tell which of the warts were intentional and which were just bad paint. While I was trying to use the thick coats of paint to my advantage, I thought I'd try something else on the mouse. I'd already put down a gray coat, so now I wanted to add a heavy brown top layer and use a brush to make it look like fur. It's probably because I used the wrong kind of brush, but either way, the mouse looked more like it had a disease than fur, so I sprayed more of the brown and let it dry so I could try something else. For this attempt, I decided to dip the brush in some gray paint and try brushing the fur on instead of off. Again, this probably wasn't the right brush to use, but at least it didn't look sick this time. Once that was dry, I used a tiny Q-tip to add some detail to the mouse's face. Some pink for the inside of the ears and a couple black dots for the eyes. I'd given up on a good paint job at this point, so I decided this was good enough. Honestly, I was pretty frustrated with my paint situation, so I pivoted from trying any further detail on the toad and just decided to do a simple green frog with the yellow belly. At least the lighter paint lets you see the texture a little better. Once the paint was dry, I found the froggiest eyes I had and glued them into place. Now, let's talk about clear coat. As usual, I use cheap UV resin. It's cheap, but so am I. So I've been using the same batch of it for almost as long as the airbrush paint that's been causing me so many problems. I had been thinking the resin wasn't curing as fast as it used to, but after this experience, I finally decided to buy some newer resin and used it on the Freedom Tiger lure. That clear coat cured in no time, and I'm not sure these are even done curing now. Lesson learned. I took this opportunity with the lures in the tanning bed and made a barb to hold the mouse's tail. It's similar to the ones for the frog legs, but this time wrapped around a split ring. The tail itself is going to be made from one of these garlicky plastic worms I found at Bass Pro. I drilled a pilot hole so it would fit over the barb easier and slid it on. I then impatiently attached it to the still tacky mouse because I couldn't wait to see it wag its tail. Then I left both lures to finish curing in the sun oven overnight. I usually like to use a curly tail worm for my frog legs because they really stir up the water. But I found these paddle tail worms that I thought better imitated frog legs and decided to try them this time. I regret everything. I'm sure the angle of the barbs isn't helping, but they look ridiculous. I know some of you have probably been yelling at me since you saw the wire harness because these aren't your typical frog style lures, and that's fair. But in my area, there really aren't fishing spots with lily pads to bounce these things off of, so I've had better luck making and using more wake baity topwater stuff. I could have put a lip on to get more of an action, but I was hoping these would be a good entry point for someone interested in trying lure making for the first time, so I kept them simple. That's also why I've pinned a comment on this video with a link where you can download this template and try this build yourself. If you do, I hope you'll share your results with me on Instagram. The FrogMouse and I would like to thank you for joining us today, and remind you to subscribe so you don't miss the next build. I'll see you then.